He vanished for 6 days. But when he returned, Hollywood's golden boy wouldn't talk. Not to reporters, not to friends, not even to his agent. Michael B. Jordan, worth millions, had become unrecognizable on purpose, living on the streets in America's most violent precinct to expose the truth. But somewhere between the hidden cameras and fake beard, he lost control of the script. One cop noticed something he shouldn't have. One inmate almost died. And now the footage has gone viral, but one question remains. What did Michael agree to in the dark that he's still too scared to say out loud? The Los Angeles sun beat down on asphalt that smelled like sweat, piss, and forgotten stories. A man in a tattered hoodie shuffled across the cracked pavement, dragging a garbage bag filled with soda cans and clothes that weren't his. Beneath the grime and the scabs glued to his cheeks was Michael B. Jordan. Yes, that Michael B. Jordan. The face you'd expect to see on movie posters, not hunched over a busted shopping cart outside a liquor store. For weeks, he'd trained with a makeup team, working with prosthetics and behavioral coaches to become someone else. Not a role, a real test. He wasn't just trying to see if he could act homeless. He wanted to see how the world acted toward the homeless, especially the people in uniform who swore an oath to protect them. His team had warned him it was dangerous. But something inside him, an old guilt that never healed, kept whispering this was the only way to make it right. At 5:13 a.m., Michael stepped out into the world alone. No entourage, no security, just hidden cameras in his coat buttons and a microphone in his shoe sole. Within the first hour, a store owner accused him of trying to steal. Within 2, a teenager threw a half-eaten burrito at his head. But he pressed on, documenting it all, narrating the moments under his breath like he was filming a documentary no one would ever see. The neighborhood was known for high police presence. And sure enough, it didn't take long. By 9:26 a.m., a patrol car pulled up beside him near a bus bench. 2 officers stepped out, one resting his hand casually on his holstered weapon. Michael kept his head down, doing everything he'd seen real homeless people do. Mumble, apologize, move along. You got ID? The taller one barked. He shook his head slowly, heart pounding behind his ribs. Name? Michael hesitated just long enough to make them suspicious. The cop's eyes narrowed. The next thing he knew, he was being handcuffed. For your own safety, they said, as they searched his belongings without a warrant. Inside the bag, a moldy sandwich, an empty bottle, and a phone with no SIM card on purpose. Everything had been planned, except this next part. He was shoved into the back seat and told he was being brought in for loitering and resisting. There was no resistance, but as the sirens flicked on and the patrol car pulled away, something settled in his chest. A grim realization that he'd underestimated just how invisible the poor and nameless could become. At the precinct, the sergeant barely looked at him. One cop laughed when they took his fingerprints, but the system didn't ping anything. Michael had pre-wiped his records using connections in the film industry. He had wanted to be just a ghost. He was about to get his wish. You'll get one call, someone muttered. But when he dialed the number, a burner line linked to his publicist, it rang twice and cut. He tried again. System error, the desk officer said with a shrug. He was processed like any other vagrant. Mugshot taken, shoelaces removed, property bag sealed. Then they walked him down a hall that smelled like bleach and fear. The holding cell had one flickering light and 6 other men in various states of collapse. One of them asked if he was new. Michael nodded. He didn't say a word. In that moment, everything felt eerily still, like the opening seconds of a horror movie when the audience knows something the characters don't. The cameras were still rolling. The test was still on. But now, he couldn't remember why he ever thought he could control what happened next. Long before the cameras and the red carpets, Michael B. Jordan had another name whispered beside his own, one that never made it to the press junkets or behind-the-scenes interviews. Tyrell. They'd grown up together in Newark, 2 skinny black boys dodging danger and dreaming big on cracked basketball courts. Tyrell was funny, sharp, and fearless, always the first to talk back to a teacher or risk detention just to make someone laugh. But as they got older, the streets got louder, more demanding, and the cracks in their world became too wide for both of them to leap. Michael had acting. Tyrell had nothing but the corner and a bottle. Their paths forked without ceremony. One day, Tyrell stopped showing up at the rec center. A month later, Michael's mom mentioned he'd been picked up for possession. Then he disappeared into the system. Years passed, and Michael's name grew brighter in the lights, while Tyrell's got lost in the static. But that guilt of having made it while Tyrell hadn't never quite left Michael. It clung to the underside of every award speech, every ad campaign, every fake laugh at a talk show couch. It whispered through the back alleys of his success, a ghost only he could hear. The moment that broke him came during a panel for a charity gala. A woman from the audience stood up and asked him what he was doing, really doing, for the people still trapped in the cycle he escaped. He smiled, dodged, pivoted like a pro. But that night he couldn't sleep. Not because of the question. Because of the answer he didn't have. That was the night he looked up Tyrell's name in a private database used by investigators. His childhood friend was listed as deceased, unsheltered, OD suspected. No funeral, no headline, just a statistic that matched a city morgue intake form. Michael stared at the screen for hours, trembling. Tyrell had become one of the forgotten, a shadow the world walked past. And Michael had done exactly that too in his own way. The success, the fame, it had insulated him from the very reality that shaped him. That night, he made a promise no one would hear but him. A promise to look poverty in the eye again, to document it, confront it, and reveal the truth of a system built to ignore. That was when the idea began to form, not a scripted piece or PSA, but something real, raw, dangerous. A performance with no lines, no retakes, and no crew. He called it Project Tyrell, and it would be his penance. For weeks, he worked with social justice activists, ex-cops turned whistleblowers, and a former homeless Navy vet who taught him how to blend in. He studied how long-term unhoused people walked, talked, even flinched. He practiced making his eyes dull, his voice unmemorable. He rehearsed desperation, not the kind that earns applause, but the kind that gets you stepped over. He emptied his mind of ego and filled it with names of the fallen. Tyrell was just one of thousands. But if even one person listened because he told the story, then maybe it wasn't too late. The deeper he went, the more he realized this wasn't just about one friend or one neighborhood. It was about a system of quiet brutality, of policies disguised as help, of neutral police practices that were anything but. Michael saw through it all now, and it sickened him. He wasn't interested in awareness anymore. He wanted exposure. And if that meant getting arrested, mistreated, or worse, then so be it. He wasn't doing this for applause. He was doing it because no one applauded for Tyrell. No one even remembered him. The final step came when he sat across from his publicist and told her the plan. Her face went pale. She warned him about the optics, the danger, the risk to his brand. He told her to wipe his digital identity for 48 hours and not to tell a soul. She didn't agree, but she did it. And as she clicked the last confirmation to wipe his background from police-accessible systems, Michael knew he was crossing a threshold he couldn't return from. On the eve of the experiment, he stood alone in front of a mirror, dressed in torn jeans and an oversized army jacket. The reflection didn't smile. It didn't pose. It just stared back, hollow and uncertain. "For you," he whispered. "For all of you." Then he smashed the burner phone he'd used for prep and slipped out the back door of his mansion, vanishing like smoke. His team would track the footage remotely, but no one would intervene unless he gave the signal. That was the deal. He was on his own, just like Tyrell had been. And this time, he intended to feel everything. Fame wouldn't shield him. Money wouldn't save him. For the first time in decades, Michael B. Jordan was just another face in the crowd, one the world wouldn't look twice at. But beneath the layers of dirt and disguise was a man who had nothing left to prove to the world. Only something left to prove to himself. The chill inside the holding cell felt deeper than the outside air, like the walls themselves were designed to leach warmth and hope from whoever sat within them. Michael shifted on the metal bench, the chains of the handcuffs around his wrists still biting from the ride over. No one had offered him water. No one had asked if he was okay. To them, he was just another vagrant in a city overflowing with them. He tried to stay silent, observing, absorbing, but the fluorescent light overhead flickered like a taunt, and the air smelled of mildew, bleach, and human waste. The other detainees barely glanced his way, used to the cycle of faces that came and went with no story attached. Michael's hidden cameras were still running, thank God. But the irony was impossible to ignore. For a man who'd starred in blockbuster films, he had never felt less seen. A young officer with tired eyes passed by the cell and barked out last names for arraignment. Jordan was not one of them. Michael leaned forward, asking if he could try the phone again. The officer didn't even pause, just walked on like a whisper had no place in this building. He'd memorized the script they gave to homeless detainees. Don't resist, don't ask too many questions, don't expect answers. Still, he hadn't planned for this level of indifference. Time in a cell moved differently, like it had no obligation to pass. A ticking clock would have been a luxury. By nightfall, one of the men in the cell began pacing, muttering to himself about rats in the walls. Another, older and wiry, suddenly slammed his fists against the bars and shouted something about needing insulin. No one came. The screaming faded into coughs, then wheezes, then silence. Michael pressed his back to the wall, hugging himself, wondering if this was how Tyrell had felt on his first night inside. The hunger crept in slowly, but the thirst hit like a slap. He'd had nothing since morning. No water, no food, just the stale breath of forgotten people. When a new shift started, he perked up, recognizing a female officer he'd seen during intake. He called out softly, asking her again to try the phone. She stopped, looked at him closely. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe, or just curiosity, but then it was gone. "You'll get processed tomorrow," she said, her voice flat, tired. "Just don't cause problems tonight." And then she was gone too. He lay down on the cold bench, clutching his coat for warmth, his mind spiraling. What if something happened out here? What if his team assumed he was fine and waited too long? What if this was exactly what had happened to Tyrell? Detained for nothing, swallowed by red tape, no one to call. The project had been carefully structured, but he hadn't anticipated system failure. Or worse, that the system was failure. Somewhere outside, millions of people would have gladly paid to see his face. But in here, he didn't even have a name. He wasn't Michael. He was just another file with missing data. As the night stretched on, the man who needed insulin collapsed. No one came. The others banged the bars, screamed for help, but it was almost an hour before someone checked. By then, he wasn't moving. Michael watched from the shadows, heart in his throat, the gravity of his experiment tipping into horror. The man was eventually wheeled out, limp and pale, while the guards pretended nothing unusual had happened. There was no report written in front of the detainees, no apology, no acknowledgement. Just another body moved like luggage. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. Every second felt like a betrayal, to Tyrell, to the others, to himself. He had set out to uncover the truth, but the truth was uglier than anything he'd prepared for. He'd expected apathy. He hadn't expected cruelty so casual it felt routine. On the morning of the second day, he asked again for a phone call. This time, a different officer laughed and said, "Maybe when we get to it." The tone was mocking, sharp. He wanted to scream, to rip off the mask and declare who he really was. But what would that prove? That they were polite only to the powerful? So he stayed quiet, biting his tongue until it tasted like blood. The cell was overcrowded now, and one man vomited into a corner drain. No one cleaned it. No one noticed. When Michael was finally called for processing on day 3, his muscles ached and his vision blurred slightly. A bureaucratic line of questions followed. Name, address, next of kin. He gave the fake information again like he'd practiced. But this time, something changed. The officer typing looked at the screen, frowned, and said, "This isn't pulling up." Michael feigned confusion. The officer tapped again, then flagged over a supervisor. The screen flashed red, then locked. "Let's put him in holding till we figure this out," the supervisor mumbled. Back he went, Same cell. Same stink. But now the glances he received were different, longer, warier. Someone must have sensed something didn't add up. It was in that moment Michael realized he'd lost control. Not of the plan, but of his safety. His anonymity was a shield, but now it had made him vulnerable. No one knew he was here. No system could vouch for him. No press agent could call in a favor. The moment the screen failed to bring up his record, he ceased to exist in the eyes of the machine. He was now in the purgatory between fiction and reality. And worse, his own team wasn't getting any signals. He'd designed it that way for integrity, for truth. But now the truth was that he was trapped. In trying to become invisible, he'd accidentally become disposable. By the fourth day, time had become irrelevant, a distant luxury for people with somewhere to be. In the holding tank, every hour felt like a year and every face like a blurred reflection of the last. The stench was unbearable. Sweat, mold, old socks. The metallic sting of blood dried onto walls no one had cleaned in weeks. Michael sat hunched in the farthest corner, his body aching, stomach clawing at itself, lips cracked and voice hoarse. His plan had been methodical, his disguise meticulous, but no amount of preparation could shield him from the psychological erosion that came from being treated as less than human. The guards didn't beat him, they didn't need to. Their silence, their indifference, the way they passed him without a glance, hurt more than fists. He'd imagined injustice would be loud, a shout, a scream. Instead, it was quiet. So quiet it could almost convince you it wasn't happening. He started noticing things, patterns that repeated like clockwork. The way certain officers referred to detainees with code words that sounded clinical but were laced with contempt. Another 27 gray meant someone who looked mentally ill. Code 7 blackout meant someone they planned to keep past their charge window without paperwork. It was routine. Legal padding used to blur human suffering into protocol. Michael witnessed a young black man hauled in for loitering, who hadn't even been allowed to finish his sentence before an officer cuffed him. The man had cried when they took his shoes, barefoot on the ice-cold floor, but the officer had only laughed and called him a flight risk. No one intervened. No one ever did. Michael tried to help where he could. He gave up his last clean sock to a man with blistered feet. He shared what little water was passed around. But it wasn't enough. The system was designed to reduce everyone inside to need, to want, to desperation. Detainees fought over slices of stale bread passed through metal flaps. A dispute over who got the wall corner led to a fistfight that ended with a man's eyebrow split open, blood dripping down his cheek as he shook silently. The guards came, separated them with zip ties, and returned to their desks like it was a routine coffee break. The blood stayed. No one cleaned it. Michael's mind fractured in small, subtle ways. He found himself forgetting what day it was, what hour. His sense of self dissolved into the rhythm of shouted orders and door buzzers. He saw a man spend 5 hours talking to a tile on the floor and another try to hang himself with a piece of his torn shirt before the guards intervened. Not with compassion, but with a stun gun. The electric crackle echoed like thunder, followed by silence so complete it made Michael's ears ring. He wanted to scream, to end it, to walk out and tell the world what he'd seen, but that would mean blowing his cover. And if he did that, the footage wouldn't matter. They'd say it was just a publicity stunt, a performance. He had to stay silent, had to suffer, had to see it through, not just for Tyrell but for every person here whose story would never be told. By day 5, something changed. The officers had started paying closer attention to him. One in particular, a lanky white man with cold eyes and a supervisor badge, had stared too long during morning rounds. "Where'd you say you were from again?" the officer asked casually. Michael mumbled the name of a fake shelter. The officer just nodded, but the glint in his eyes said he wasn't buying it. From that moment on, Michael felt watched. Not in the passive, routine way they watch detainees, but in the deliberate, investigative way someone watches a threat. His heart raced every time the officer passed. He feared that someone had begun to recognize him, or at least suspect that he wasn't who he claimed to be. But if that was true, why hadn't they acted yet? That night, he overheard a chilling conversation. Two guards, unaware that he was awake, joked about a cleanup job they'd done last month, about planting a bag of heroin on a mouthy detainee and letting him rot in county. They laughed like it was nothing, like they were talking about a prank. One of them said, "You ever see that kid in the Marvel movies? He looks like that. You think it's him?" The other shrugged. "Don't matter. If it is, we'll know soon enough." Michael's blood went cold. They didn't just suspect. They knew. But they were waiting. For what, he didn't know. Later, an officer approached him with a folded paper and whispered, "You got a fan out there." Inside was a crude sketch of his face with the words, "I.S. this him?" scrawled beside it. The note was unsigned, but the message was clear. Someone was fishing for confirmation. His anonymity had cracked. The camera in his button still rolled, capturing the slow unraveling of the plan. But even the footage wouldn't matter if it ended with his silence. He began to wonder whether he'd make it out at all. Whether the system, now aware of who he might be, would try to bury the truth instead of release it. He was no longer just playing a role. He was a threat. And he knew, from what he'd seen, that threats in here didn't leave through the front door. That night, he made a decision. If something happened to him, if he didn't walk out on his own, his team would release everything. Every second of footage, every hidden file, every note he'd documented and stored remotely. He'd programmed it that way, a final failsafe. The system may have been trying to chew him up, but he'd made sure it wouldn't swallow him without consequence. As the lights dimmed and the cell doors locked for the night, he stared up at the ceiling, not as an actor, not as a celebrity, but as a witness. And witnesses, once awakened, are the most dangerous people in any system built on silence. The turning point came on the 6th night, when a new detainee was dragged in around midnight, bleeding from the mouth and barely conscious. He was no older than 22, tall, rail-thin, with shaking hands cuffed behind his back and eyes swollen nearly shut. The guards tossed him into the cell like garbage, muttering something about aggressive behavior during intake. But the look in the kid's eyes screamed trauma, not violence. Michael watched in horror as the other inmates huddled away from the boy, not out of fear, but because they already knew how this would end. Blood was a curse in here. It brought punishment, not help. The young man curled into himself, whispering nonsense through busted lips, and Michael moved toward him, crouched, asked softly if he could hear him. No response, just a moan. He reached out gently to adjust the boy's position so he could breathe better. But before he could even lift the kid's head, the metal door behind him flew open with a bang. 2 guards stormed in, shouting commands, one yelling, "Step away from the body!" like Michael was a threat. They yanked him backward, slammed him into the bars, twisted his arm until he felt something pop in his shoulder. "Trying to play hero?" The taller one growled, his breath hot and foul against Michael's cheek. Michael winced in pain, biting back a scream, and didn't fight it. Fighting would make it worse. They hauled the unconscious kid out without even checking his vitals, muttering, "He'll be fine," as they disappeared down the hall. The other inmates went silent. No one made eye contact. Michael leaned back against the wall, his shoulder throbbing, 1,000 thoughts flashing in his head, but all pointing to one conclusion. This had gone too far. This wasn't a documentary anymore. This was a powder keg, and someone had just lit the fuse. That morning, Michael cracked. For the first time since he entered the jail, he requested to speak to a ranking officer. He was told to wait. An hour passed, then another. Finally, he was taken to a side room with a metal desk and a camera pointed at the ceiling. Across from him sat the same officer who'd been eyeing him all week, the one with the supervisor badge and the too cold stare. He introduced himself only as Lieutenant Marsh. Marsh didn't ask questions. He simply pulled out a file folder, opened it, and slid a photo across the table. It was Michael, not in disguise, but in a tuxedo on the red carpet, smiling at the premiere of his last film. "Took us a little while," Marsh said, tapping the photo. "But you don't stay anonymous long with a face like this." Michael stayed still, didn't speak. Marsh leaned in. "So now I have to decide what to do with you." Michael's mind raced. He could try to explain, try to appeal to the man's conscience. but Marsh's eyes held no space for empathy. "You embarrassed us?" Marsh said quietly, almost like he was hurt. "This little experiment of yours, it could cost a lot of people their jobs, families, lives. You think you're a hero, but all you've done is put targets on people's backs." He closed the file. "So here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna walk out of here, and you're gonna keep your mouth shut. No footage, no exposé, no press conference. In exchange, we make sure no one finds out what you did either. Impersonating someone you're not, falsifying records, tampering with evidence. I've got enough here to bury you if I wanted to." Michael's stomach turned. It wasn't just a threat. It was a trap. The officer knew about his erased data trail, the burner phone, the falsified name. All of it. And in this place, where everything had been gray and lifeless, suddenly everything felt red. Like danger. Like betrayal. He sat frozen as Marsh stood up, walking to the door. Before leaving, Marsh turned and said, "You think exposing us changes anything? You're not the first. You won't be the last. And this place eats people like you." The door slammed shut behind him. Alone in the room, Michael's hands trembled beneath the table. They knew who he was. They'd been watching. And now they were making him an offer. A dirty one. Protect their secrets and they'd protect his. But if he went public, they'd destroy him in the same system he had hoped to dismantle. Back in his cell, the weight of it pressed on him like concrete. He didn't eat. He barely moved. The young man who'd been beaten never returned. No one gave an answer. The silence screamed. That night, a note was slipped under the door of his cell. It was written in blocky handwriting on the back of a cafeteria receipt. It read, "We see you. We believe you. Don't stop." There was no signature, no explanation, but it was the first crack of light Michael had seen in days. Someone inside this rotting place still had a voice, and they were using it to reach him. He tucked the note inside his shoe, beside the micro SD card he'd been recording to. Every second of his journey was there. Every insult, every abuse, every moment of silence when someone should have spoken. The question wasn't whether he could smuggle it out. The question was whether he'd have the strength to release it, knowing full well what the fallout might be. He wasn't just exposing injustice anymore. He was making enemies with power, people who'd already shown what they were willing to do to preserve the illusion of order. He lay awake until morning, going over every word Marsh had said, every face he'd seen in the last 6 days. Trust was impossible. Escape was dangerous. But staying silent, that was a death of a different kind. The next day, without explanation, he was told he'd be released. No formal charges. No paperwork. Just processing error as the reason for detainment. It was too clean, too sudden. They were trying to cover their tracks. Get him out before more eyes turned toward the truth. As he walked past the guard station in the same clothes he'd arrived in, he locked eyes with Marsh one last time. No words were exchanged. But the look said everything. "We're watching you." He stepped out into the sunlight like a man who had clawed his way out of hell. But the war wasn't over. It had just begun. In the weeks following the reveal, it became evident that Mark Wahlberg's decision to go undercover hadn't just sparked outrage. It had ignited a nationwide reckoning. What began as a viral clip of police misconduct grew into a sweeping movement that questioned not only the behavior of law enforcement but the entire societal structure that allowed such abuses to persist in the shadows. City after city found itself under the microscope. Journalists began launching their own investigations, spurred by the attention Mark's story brought. Local news stations that once ignored the homeless crisis began interviewing shelter directors, formerly unhoused individuals, and police whistleblowers who now felt empowered to speak. The footage Mark released wasn't just a one-off. Activist groups began compiling similar videos from other cities, compiling a vast, crowdsourced dossier of abuse, mistreatment, and neglect. What had once been brushed off as exaggeration was now undeniable, captured in high definition, narrated by someone whose fame forced the world to listen. But with attention came resistance. Not everyone was eager to see change. In several cities, protests turned tense as counter-demonstrators accused Wahlberg of demonizing law enforcement and manipulating public opinion. Talk show pundits argued on split screens, debating whether what he did was bravery or betrayal. Mark refused to be drawn into these battles. He issued one final public statement. This was never about me versus them. This was about the us we pretend doesn't exist. The people who fall between the cracks, who get ignored until it's too late. I just held up a mirror. Despite efforts to politicize the movement, real change began to emerge. Police departments in multiple jurisdictions quietly began implementing new de-escalation training. A few even partnered with local shelters to develop empathy-based interaction protocols. One city passed emergency funding for mental health responders to accompany officers during nonviolent wellness checks. Shelters reported an unprecedented rise in volunteers, donations, and outreach programs. Churches opened their basements. Schools launched food drives. College students began organizing streetwalk witness initiatives, where they simply walked with and listened to unhoused individuals, documenting their stories. The federal government, under pressure from both sides of the aisle, announced a new oversight initiative targeting urban policing standards. While far from perfect, it marked the first time in decades that homelessness and police reform were being addressed under the same legislative umbrella. But with visibility came vulnerability. Mark's security team intercepted multiple credible threats, emails, letters, even an anonymous voicemail promising retaliation. One officer under investigation publicly blamed Wahlberg for ruining his life, claiming the celebrity's actions led to death threats against his family. Lawsuits began to circle, some frivolous, some real. A tabloid ran a hit piece suggesting Mark had hired private actors to stage parts of the footage, a claim debunked within hours but not before it trended online. Despite this, the momentum didn't die. Mark stayed the course, choosing substance over spotlight. He refused endorsement deals and speaking engagements that came pouring in from political parties and corporations eager to attach themselves to the movement. Instead, he founded a nonprofit initiative named Unseen, dedicated to documenting, advocating, and funding long-term solutions for the homeless crisis and police accountability. Unseen quickly gained traction, not because of Mark's name but because of its raw, unfiltered approach. The organization deployed small teams across the country to record real stories, working with local filmmakers, activists, and those directly impacted by neglect and brutality. One of the first videos they released featured Tommy, the friend who had inspired the mission in the first place, now employed by the foundation, mentoring others with lived experience. That video alone brought in over 5 million views in a week and inspired dozens of former first responders to come forward with their own struggles navigating homelessness. Documentaries were proposed. University case studies began forming around Wahlberg's experiment. But the biggest shift wasn't in policy, media, or academia. It was in the streets. In cities across the country, people began behaving differently. Commuters made eye contact. Store owners left out water bottles. Children asked questions instead of crossing the street. Small changes, perhaps, but real ones. And for many, that was enough to believe change was possible. Mark avoided Hollywood for the rest of that year. He turned down scripts, skipped award shows, and kept his interviews minimal. When asked what he had learned most from the experience, he replied, "That being invisible is worse than being hated. At least when you're hated, someone knows you exist." He never claimed to be a hero, and he never apologized for what he'd done. What he had hoped for, a spark, had turned into something bigger than he imagined. And though the battle was far from over, the world now saw what it had ignored for far too long. As winter approached, Mark returned to one of the corners he had once slept on, this time dressed like himself. A woman walked past and did a double take. She didn't ask for a photo. She simply smiled and said, "Thank you." Mark nodded, slipping a folded bill into a nearby man's cup, then kept walking. The cameras weren't rolling. The press wasn't watching. But this moment, quiet and unrecorded, was perhaps the most powerful of all, proof that sometimes the biggest change begins in silence, long after the noise has faded.